Welcome back. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Anna MacDonald. I'm one of the booksellers at the Paperback Bookshop. Last time I was here, I spoke to you about and read briefly from Derek Jarman's Modern Nature, and I mentioned that I had come to reading Jarman via reading the work of Olivia Laing. I didn't say that Olivia Laing had written the introduction to that vintage edition of Modern Nature, and I thought it seemed like a natural progression to then today read a little bit from Olivia Laing's first book, To the River, also because Olivia Laing has a new collection of essays which is out any day now, Art in the Time of Emergency, which is a book we all need, but especially now. So I've been reading Olivia Laing for many years now. I've read all of her books. It's very hard to pick a favourite, but I felt like I was missing the river today. I lived alongside the river for well over a decade, and today in my confinement I felt like a river walk, but we're a fair way from it now. So I thought I'd do the next best thing and revisit To the River. I thought there's no better place to start than the beginning. So I'm going to read the first chapter, and I hope you enjoy it. I'd forgotten until I got the book out to read to you today too that it's another April book as well, which seems fitting. So, To the River by Olivia Laing. Chapter 1, Clearing Out. I'm haunted by waters. It may be that I'm too dry in myself, too English, or it may be simply that I'm susceptible to beauty, but I do not feel truly at ease on this earth unless there's a river nearby. When it hurts, wrote the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz, we return to the banks of certain rivers, and I take comfort in his words, for there's a river I've returned to over and again, in sickness and in health, in grief, in desolation and in joy. I first came to the Ouse one June evening a decade back. I was with a boyfriend long since relinquished, and we drove from Brighton, leaving my car in the field at Barkham Mills and walking north against the current as the last few fishermen swung their lures in hope of pike or bass. The thickening air was full of the scent of meadowsweet, and if I looked closely, I could make out a scurf of petals drifting idly along the bank. The river ran brimful at the edge of an open field, and as the sun dropped, its smell became more noticeable, that cold green reek by which wild water betrays its presence. I stopped to dip a hand, and as I did so I remembered Virginia Woolf drowned here in the Ouse, though why or when I didn't know. For a while I used to swim with a group of friends at Southease, near where her body was found. I'd enter the swift water in trepidation that gave way to ecstasy, tugged by a current that threatened to tumble me beneath the surface and bowl me clean to the sea. The river passed in that region through a chalk valley ridged by the downs, and the chalk seeped into the water and turned it the milky green of sea glass, full of little shafts of imprisoned light. You couldn't see the bottom, you could barely make out your own limbs, and perhaps it was this opacity which made it seem as though the river was the bearer of secrets, that beneath its surface something lay concealed. It wasn't morbidity perhaps, that drew me to that dangerous place, but rather the pleasure of abandoning myself to something vastly beyond my control. I was pulled to the Ouse as a magnet is pulled to metal, returning on summer nights and during the short winter days to repeat some walks, some swims through turning seasons until they amassed the weight of ritual. I'd come to that corner of Sussex idly and with no intention of staying long, but it seems to me now that the river cast a lure, that it caught me on the fly and held me heart-stopped there. And when things began to falter in my own life, it was the Ouse to which I returned. In the spring of 2009, I became caught up in one of those minor crises that periodically afflict a life, when the scaffolding that sustains us seems destined to collapse. I lost a job by accident, and then, through sheer carelessness, I lost the man I loved. He was from Yorkshire, and one of the skirmishes in our long battle concerned territory, namely, where in the country we would make our home. I couldn't relinquish Sussex, and nor could he quite edge himself from the hills and moors to which he had, after all, only just returned. After Matthew left, I lost the knack of sleeping. Brighton seemed unsettled, and at night it was very bright. The hospital over the road had recently been abandoned, and I'd look up sometimes from my work to see a gang of boys breaking windows or setting fires in the yard where ambulances once parked. At periodic intervals throughout the day, I felt that I was drowning, and it was all I could do not to fling myself to the ground and wail like a child. These feelings of panic, which in more sober moments I knew were temporary and would soon pass, were somehow intensified by the loveliness of that April. The trees were flaring into life, first the chestnut with its upraised candles, and then the elm and beech. Amid this wash of green, the cherry began to flower, and within days the streets were filled with a flush of blossom that clogged the drains and papered the windscreens of parked cars. The shift in season was intoxicating, and it was then that the idea of walking the river locked hold of me. I wanted to clear out in all senses of the phrase, and I felt somewhere deep inside me that the river was where I needed to be. I began to buy maps compulsively, though I've always been map shy. Some I pinned to my wall. One, a geological chart of the underlying ground, was so beautiful I kept it by my bed. What I had in mind was a survey or sounding, a way of catching and logging what a little patch of England looked like one midsummer week at the beginning of the 21st century. That's what I told people, anyway. The truth was less easy to explain. I wanted somehow to get beneath the surface of the daily world, as a sleeper shrugs off the ordinary air and crests towards dreams. A river passing through a landscape catches the world and gives it back redoubled. A shifting, glinting world, more mysterious than the one we customarily inhabit. Rivers run through our civilizations like strings through beads, and there's hardly an age I can think of that's not associated with one great waterway. The lands of the Middle East have dried to tinder now, but once they were fertile, fed by the fruitful Euphrates and the Tigris, from which rose flowering Sumer and Babylonia. The riches of ancient Egypt stemmed from the Nile, which was believed to mark the causeway between life and death, and which was twinned in the heavens by the spill of stars we now call the Milky Way. The Indus Valley, the Yellow River, these are the places where civilizations began, fed by sweet waters that in their flooding enriched the land. The art of writing was independently born in these four regions, and I do not think it a coincidence that the advent of the written word was nourished by river water. There is a mystery about rivers that draws us to them, for they rise from hidden places and travel by routes that are not always tomorrow where they might be today. Unlike a lake or sea, a river has a destination, and there is something about the certainty with which it travels that makes it very soothing, particularly for those who've lost faith with where they're headed. The Ouse seemed to me then to be composed of two elements. On the one hand, it was the thing itself, a river 42 miles long that rose in a copse of oak and hazel not far from Haywards Heath, dashing in quick gills and riffles through the ancient forests of the Weald, traversing the downs at Lewes and entering the oil-streaked channel at Newhaven, where the ferries cross over to France. Such waterways are ten a penny in these islands. I dare say there is one that runs near you, a pretty middling river that winds through towns and fields alike, neither pristinely wild nor reliably tame. The days of watermills and sultans may have passed, but the Ouse remains a working river after a fashion of our times, feeding a brace of reservoirs and carrying the outfall from a dozen sewage works. Sometimes, swimming at Isfield, you pass through clotted tracks of bubbles. Sometimes a crop of waterweed blooms as luxuriant as an orchard with the fertilizer that's washed from the wheat. But a river moves through time as well as space. Rivers have shaped our world. They carry with them, as Joseph Conrad had it, the dreams of men, the seed of commonwealths, the germs of empires. Their presence has always lured people, and so they bear, like litter, the cast-off relics of the past. The Ouse is not a major waterway. It has intersected with the wider currents of history only once or twice, when Virginia Woolf drowned there in 1941, and again centuries earlier when the Battle of Lewes was fought upon its banks. Nonetheless, its relationship with man can be traced back thousands of years before the birth of Christ, to when Neolithic settlers first started to cut down the forests and cultivate crops by the river's edge. The ages that followed left more palpable traces: Saxon villages, a Norman castle, Tudor sewage works, Georgian embankments and sluices designed to relieve the river's tendency to overflow, though even these elaborate modifications failed to prevent the Ouse from rising up and cataclysmically flooding the town of Lewes in the early years of our own millennium. At times it feels as if the past is very near. On certain evenings when the sun has dropped and the air is turning blue, when barn owls float above the meadow grass and a pared-down moon breaches the tree line, a mist will sometimes lift from the surface of the river. It is then that the strangeness of water becomes apparent. The earth hoards its treasures, and what is buried there remains until it's disinterred by spade or plough. But a river is more shifty, relinquishing its possessions haphazardly and without regard to the landlocked chronology historians hold so dear. A history compiled by way of water is by its nature quick and fluid, full of submerged life and capable, as I would discover, of flooding unexpectedly into the present. That spring I was reading Woolf obsessively, for she shared my preoccupation with water and its metaphors. Over the years, Virginia Woolf has gained a reputation as a doleful writer, a bloodless neurasthenic, or again as a spiteful, rarefied creature, the doyenne of airless Bloomsbury chat. I suspect the people who hold this view have not read her diaries, for they are filled with humour and an infectious love for the natural world. Virginia first came to the Ouse in 1912, renting a house set high above the marshes. She spent the first night of her marriage to Leonard Woolf there, and later stayed at the house to recover from her third in a succession of serious breakdowns. In 1919, sane again, she switched to the other side of the river, buying a cold, bluish cottage beneath Rodmell's church tower. It was very primitive when they first arrived, with no hot water and a dank earth closet furnished with a cane chair above a bucket. But Virginia and Leonard both loved Monk's House, and its peace and isolation proved conducive to work. Much of Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, The Waves, and Between the Acts was written there, along with hundreds of reviews, short stories, and essays. She was acutely sensitive to landscape, and her impressions of this chalky, watery valley pervade her work. Her solitary, often daily excursions seem to have formed an essential part of the writing process. During the Asham breakdown, when she was banned from the overstimulations of either walking or writing, she confided longingly to her diary, "What wouldn't I give to be coming through Furley Woods? The brain laid up in sweet lavender, so sane and cool, and ripe for the morrow's task. How I should notice everything, the phrase for it coming the moment after and fitting like a glove. And then on the dusty road, as I ground my pedals, so my story would begin telling itself. And then the sun would be done, and home, and some bout of poetry after dinner, half read, half lived, as if the flesh were dissolved, and through it the flowers burst, red and white." As if the flesh were dissolved is a characteristic phrase. Woolf's metaphors for the process of writing, for entering the dream world in which she thrived, are fluid. She writes of plunging, flooding, going under, being submerged. This desire to enter the depths is what drew me to her, for though she eventually founded for a time, it seemed she possessed, like some freedivers, a gift for descending beneath the surface of the world. As I sat in my hot little room, I began to feel like an apprentice escape artist studying Houdini. I wanted to know how the trick was mastered, and I wanted to know how those effortless plunges turned into a vanishing act of a far more sinister sort. Spring was giving way to summer. I decided to leave the city on the solstice, the hinge point of the year when light is at its peak. The superstitions about the day appealed to me. It's when the wall between worlds is said to grow thin. And it's no coincidence that Shakespeare set his topsy-turvy dream on Midsummer Eve, for on the year's Bryfest night, magic and misrule have always held sway. England is at her most beautiful in the month of June, and in the days before I left, I began to feel almost maddened by my desire to go out into the flowering fields and enter the cool, steady river. My flat began to fill up with anxious lists. I purchased a rucksack and a pair of lightweight trousers with blossom printed jauntily along the waist. My mother sent me a pair of sandals of unparalleled hideousness that she swore, falsely as it turned out, were designed to prevent blisters. I spent a pleasant afternoon booking rooms in pubs along the route, including the White Hart in Lewes, where Virginia and Leonard Woolf bought Monk's house at auction, and then, in the excitement of the moment, had a brief and violent fight. I also bought a vast quantity of oat cakes and a large slab of cheese. I might lack variety, but I wouldn't starve. In all this time I'd barely spoken to Matthew, and the night before I left I did a forbidden thing. I rang him, and at some point in the tangled, recriminatory conversation that followed, I began to weep and found I couldn't stop. It was, though I didn't know it then, the nadir, the lowest point of that dismal spring. The next day was the solstice. After that, though the days began to shorten, something in me started to lighten and lift. If you don't want to keep going after that, I don't know what would make you want to continue reading. I think it's time I returned. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time. Bye. Take care.